Hi, and welcome everyone to this week's SIG Lifecycle meeting. Today it's the 29th of May, and soon is code freeze. We're going to talk about that. Some other things needed for 1.11 as well, and some issues need to be resolved. And I'll start with letting Tim speak to the first point.
Yeah, I just want to do a PSA that code freeze is the end of this week. So please, any new feature PRs have to be done by the end of this week. And I know that there will be minor bug fixes that will go in after the fact. Ideally try to get your PRs in before the end of the week. They have to be LGTM'd in order for them to get in. I do think that the release is tentatively planned for June 19th. Somebody correct me if I'm wrong there. I have to double check with the release folks. But that gives you 2 weeks of code freeze to get all the tests in place and all the bugs fixed. That's my current understanding, unless somebody else says something else.
Yeah, I think that should be the case. At least everything needs to be LGTM'd by the 5th, and I think code slush is a bit before this week sometime, which effectively means that we should mark all PRs that should get into 1.11 should be marked with a milestone.
Yeah, I think I went through the backlog from our side today, and we're pretty good with our backlog. So the folks that are committed on our side are pretty much lined up. There's a bunch of documentation stuff, and I consider documentation to be asynchronous. So if it hits the milestone, it hits the milestone. But I'm sure somebody's going to nail me on that one someday. But other than that, I do believe that everything is reasonable. There are a couple of issues I wanted to discuss today because some of them are a little awkward, and I think they're worthy of discussion that are separate.
Yeah, I'm checking the milestone here. So myself and Hippie Hacker did a pairing session on the EDE tests some days ago, and that went well. We have a PR up for review. I think the test info folks are going to check into that today or similar. So
do you know which EDE tests? There's so many. The Kubernetes tests?
So yeah, so our the 3 suites we have for all other branches as well. So the first is like run kubedm 1.11, create a 1.11 cluster using kubedm 1.11. And the other one is create a 1.10 cluster with kubedm 1.10 and upgrade it to 1.11 with kubedm 1.11. That is the upgrade job. And then we have the third is create a 1.10 cluster using kubedm CLI 1.11. So that is the exact thing as we have for any other branch. I'm gonna link to it here. There we go. So that is also under control. D have been adding the EDE tests for the kubelet that we need, which is really helpful. Can I find that? Somewhere here. And we got a bunch of PRs merged. Yeah, there it is. We got a bunch of PRs merged over the weekend as well, which is always good. And if we check the 1.11 list, we have now 36 open issues. Most of them are documentation ones.
Yeah, there's a lot of docs.
So there's one for packaging CRI CTL in our debs that is under control for now, I think. Doesn't take too much time to do. And there's some bug fixes that we need to get done. And
I did want to talk to one of them, which is the next agenda item. We kind of jumping around a little bit in the agenda, but there's a specific one that is thorny, and there's two separate issues linked against it. The one I linked in the document is the one that you logged, but Jason has a separate issue which is directly related to, which is the hostname override for the kubelet. And there's a weird, the way it's not the kubelet, it's the proxy actually. And the way the proxy is deployed with the component configuration, it actually has created a conundrum because we don't have a way of providing an override flag to just the proxies themselves to use the local host name. So on some cloud providers like AWS, we actually, inside of our quick start, we cribbed this little hack, which I totally don't like, but we need to fix, which is basically a init container for the proxies to make sure that we get the hostname override in place because of the way the configuration apparatus works. It is very ugly, and it is a broader problem with the component configuration for the proxy. I'll stop there, and hopefully people have.
So there's two things that need to be fixed here. One is the proxy should probably be somewhat smarter when doing the auto detection here. I guess without having looked into the code line by line. But first, we should at least try to talk to SIG node. Could we make it detect this scenario where the kubelet has,
It's not the node, it's the proxy that we're having problems with, at least on our side, the ones that we've detected.
Yeah. So like, can we talk to SIG networking and see, can the proxy detect this scenario where the host name doesn't equal the node API object name? That is a separate bug. And then we've said this multiple times, but we need to get the proxy to do component config correctly and on beta level. And when that happens, it's going to do so that we feed it a configuration file. And even though we do that, we can specify any flag that is instance specific, like hostname override, to it anyway, and it will work.
It currently doesn't work though. That's the problem.
Yeah. But that is because it's doing the component config wrong. So, and that's because it's understaffed, I guess. But we need to prioritize fixing the proxy itself.
So here's a general broader question, and I'm looking at you, Robert, because no one seems to own it from the Google side, the component configuration graduating over time, right? So I know that some Red Hatters did the initial updates for both the scheduler and the proxy, but there's no one to drive it to completion or an owner. Mike Toffin was definitely owning the kubelet side of things, but we need somebody we need some owner, whoever may be in these other SIGs, to drive that over the line.
Yeah, so every other SIG that I talked to basically said they're waiting for Mike Toffin's work to land and to sort of pave the road, and they're all in a holding pattern until that happens. And so I think we've sort of convinced other people that it's the right way to go, with the caveat of the API server. I think that's a harder sell for some reason. I think they just have a lot of other priorities. But for most of the other teams and SIGs that I've talked to, they all seem to think that it's a good idea, but that they aren't ready to invest in it until it's sort of been proven. And the kubelet is a really tough use case that hits a lot of the sort of hardest pieces of component config. And so most people believe that if that is proven to work, that their piece will be much easier to do, and that all of the sort of hard parts will have been figured out. And so Mike has been sort of plowing forward driving that for the kubelet, and it's looks like it's in pretty good shape for 1.11. So I think we'll have an easier time selling other people on it after that. And he's been also following up with some other folks also, like Walter Fender, who's working on the controller manager and the cloud controller manager split, about using component config as well. So I know he told me on his agenda was to go through some of their code reviews and make sure that they're doing it the right way. So he's sort of fully vested in making sure it gets spread as well. And he also understands that he's sort of on the critical path for that.
Okay, but interim, we have a bunch of bugs. we need somebody. It's kind of like nailing Joe to the wall right now. I don't exactly know. Somebody's gonna have to own this stuff on the other side to make sure at least it gets reviewed and bug fixed in a reasonable time. I don't know if we have people from our side who want to be able to jump up into this stuff. It's a little thorny, but I think there are people who can help navigate the landscape to get it done. But I do think some of this stuff are blocker worthy for the release, because it is very ugly, the fixes to get them in.
So given that, like, the status update, meanwhile, is that dynamic kubelet config is completed. The API types themselves got to be the last cycle in 1.10. This cycle, 1.11, Mike Toffen has completed the work of graduating dynamic kubelet config to beta, which is great. So technically, we could use it. We won't. We have a lot of other, like, we're doing it step by step. So we're basically having it, but we don't just enable the order rotation thing. We just download the file statically. But given this and what you said, Robert, it means, or it sounds to me, that the road is unblocked for virtually all other people, because it's has now been in 2 release cycles, 1.10 and 1.11.
Yeah, I think that other people are sort of waiting for it to hit production, basically, right? So they want to see dynamic kube config in practice, in a release, sort of being used, and make sure that there aren't any sort of gotchas, that if they switch their component over, they're going to have a large maintenance burden as a result. And I think that what we've talked about with Mike was, he's building dynamic kubelet config, but the first part of that is static kubelet config, which is basically read from a file instead of command line flags. And even if every different binary supported static config via component config, that would be a huge step forward for us, because it would give us API machinery around the configuration. It would give us forward and backward compatibility. I mean, it would be so helpful, right? And I think that that's sort of what we want from people as a first step. I don't care if it's dynamic. Like, I can kick a process and point at a new config file. That's not a problem. It's like reading from a file instead of flags is the big jump.
Yeah, actually, so when I'm talking about component config generally, I'm just talking about the static thing. That we have this structured configuration using the Kubernetes API machinery, so the component can read from a file. I don't either require folks to or like the SIGs to do this dynamic thing. I think it might only be needed for the kubelet to some extent if we do stuff like hosting in a pod, and we can have the kubelet to like re-kick the API server process or whatever. That's really easy. But given now that we have had the static kubelet, the static component configuration stuff in, and it's used in GCE kubeup scripts in production, yes. Can we get buy-in from like other folks to do this, and can Google help out here? Because like the kube proxy part is really annoying. So if not, it's basically at its current state, it's going to block kubemga and be one of the last blockers. So if it doesn't get fixed in 1.12, we're basically just waiting for that. Because
I'll happily block this release until we get a fix for some of this. And I don't care if I play the human heat shield. It is a really bad fix for dealing with it. So
let's maybe take this offline and try to loop in Mike Toffen So I think he said that he knew who on the SIG networking team was working on component config or had been working on it for kubeproxy, and if they're working on it today. And I think he's close to those people and can sort of help prioritize and turn the screws there as well. So I think that would be helpful. And maybe not take too much more time in this meeting.
Is there a link to the upstream bug though?
There's a link in the notes that links to other links that it's like the meta forker of links. So
Yeah,
the issue,
it's not very clear what we're asking to be fixed, right?
kubeadm issue 846 has links to all the other links. So basically there are a bunch of issues with how the ordering of overrides occurs because of it's basically they took some of the flags and they put them into dynamic proxy configuration or into proxy configuration.
Static proxy configuration.
Okay, yes. They took some of the flags and they put it into static proxy configuration, but they actually really need to either be flags or need to have the ability to be overridden on a per host name basis. So like if you had a templated way of doing this or something, that would work, but I apparently heard that templating people don't like that idea, so. So
the problem is like what the kubelet does and what the kube proxy should do is that it takes the static config, reads it, and if you have overrides that are instance specific as flags, it will happily accept those. It doesn't do that right now, which is that problem. But the other route why we even would have to do this is that, well, the kube proxy can't detect itself that it has the node API object name is different from the host name. That is the other like bug, and if we could get that first bug fixed so that it could auto detect correctly, we won't even need this component config flag precedence thing.
Yeah, there's a general.
Yeah, it's a general problem, but we don't need it badly for the next release. Yeah. But either of them basically needs to get fixed.
Yeah, the more general problem is we rely on short host name all over the place, and it's built into the code, and that's a general problem that exists.
I remember Justin opening issues about that like 1-2 years ago. Yeah, it is. So we'll take it offline with Robert and Mike to see who can own the kube proxy thing. So I mean, the problem is Peter has his PR for graduating and like moving stuff around up for like more than half a year, soon a year, but we lack approvers. Nobody has like had time to review and like get it over the line. But the code has actually been written to a large extent already. Anyway, we'll take more of that offline and get back to the SIG next time what the conclusions are, and we'll try to talk to SIG networking about fixing the auto detection or fixing the flag precedence with Mike, because he knows what to do there. And yeah, then the general problem is component config is under own. But yeah, what I started thinking about like the other day here was that if we had version component config for every component, all the control plane components could just have their config C endpoint, and we could just like an E2E test or whatever could just check with the API server, check with the controller manager scheduler, do they support this kind of feature? Is it enabled? What is the blah, blah, blah configuration in the cluster? Because now we don't have any way to query that. If we had, it would be super easy to have config endpoints for everything. Of course, authenticated and similar, but authorized. But still, that would be a huge improvement for the general ecosystem as well, and might be a benefit we could try to sell to people.
Why don't we take this meta discussion to a different topic? I mean, like at another point, maybe in planning for the next release cycle, because the config.z endpoint had a bunch of people needling it to death over time, and it was even ripped out. So it was ripped out of the API server. So there did exist a config.z endpoint for everything, and it got pruned back, and it's no longer useful. But yes.
Okay. Next up, Ruben is working on a 1.11 test plan.
Is this just a PSA, Ruben? I don't know if you want to like speak up, because I don't want to totally throw you under a bus here. But part of 1.10 is we missed a bunch of user stories for upgrade scenarios and issues, and we'll probably share with the SIG, hopefully, a test plan that folks can enumerate. And I think it'd be helpful to get broader feedback on things that don't currently have test coverage, that we want to have test coverage for this cycle, and eventually we'll try to get those into automation. But I think it'd be useful for folks to be able to solicit feedback, or to get their ideas into at least a spreadsheet of some kind, or a doc of some kind, for us to be able to start getting a little more formalized around testing. Ruben, do you want to speak more to it?
No, I think you summarized it correctly. Basically, is that for now, these initial stages, what we need is what folks think would be most useful in terms of which areas need more care, more detail, and if they have any ideas, actually, how to, whether something should be done, whether it should be a manual test or an automated test. Ideally, it's all automated, but not everything can be proactive. Basically, we are at the soliciting ideas stage, and I think you framed it correctly.
Okay,
so
cool.
Perhaps tomorrow we'll send a link on Slack and put it in the meeting notes for other people to chime in on.
Yeah. So we recently updated our ONS files in CMD Kubernetes. I checked the other day. I don't know if it's true anymore, but I realized that many of these that we added are not in our GitHub teams. So we should add them. I could be a maintainer for the teams themselves, so I could add, but I'm not. I think it's Tim and Robert for the moment.
Which teams are you talking about?
The SIG class lifecycle ones.
Not the kubeadmin ones? Because you are a maintainer on the kubeadmin ones that I just looked at.
I think the general SIG class lifecycle ones are basically the one we're using for kubeadmin as well. If we think it makes sense to like do Kubernetes / kubeadm reviews or whatever else, kubeadm PR reviews, kubeadm features, etc. That could make sense, but right now we use the main SIG class lifecycle tag.
Okay. Yeah, I'm looking right now. It looks like Tim and I are both maintainers.
Yeah.
I think inherited from some other permission and not directly on this repo.
Yeah, it's like just I don't know where or who that how that happens, but
do we want to append only, or do we want to take people off? Do we want to not take people off unless they request to be removed? Because there were a bunch of names that got pulled out in that same PR, right? We removed Joe and Chris Rousey and Jamie and a couple other folks, right?
I think that unless people leave themselves, it's okay to have them there, because it's like just notifications. So I mean, I've been in teams that made me get way too many unnecessary notifications, so then I just left to be able to have some kind of structure. So yeah.
I'm happy to add all the people that are here. Just to be clear where I'm going to add them to, do you think they want to be signed up for all the SIG cluster lifecycle star groups and the kubeadm groups? Or are there specific ones we want to put them in? Like,
so I think
and bugs. I think right now the membership is pretty consistent across all the teams. They all are between 17 and 20 people.
Yeah, I think
it seems like it makes sense to put them in every group.
Yeah, I think it makes sense because I don't know if we even have a clear structure on what we tag and where, and external people at least don't. So just adding them in every. And again, if you don't want to be there, just leave. Add them to Kubernetes previews as well.
Sure. All right, I'll start going through and doing that right now during this meeting.
Perfect. Okay. So before I dive into a bit more on the milestone for 111, I just saw Justin here. So what is the status of CUPS? How is it going? And
CUPS is going great. We are actually on the big thing that we're working on is the etcd manager, and so we finally got an etcd2 to etcd3 upgrade of HA clusters to work, which basically unblocks every CUPS cluster from moving to etcd3, and also like cluster resizes. So yeah, so that's the sort of big unblocker in CUPS land. And then I hope to bring that when it's a little bit more stable to this group, in the hope that we can, look at adopting it for all clusters. The etcd2 to etcd3 migration isn't as important for other people, I think. Hopefully there will never be an etcd3 to etcd4 migration of the same ilk. The other features it does bring are sort of nicer recovery and the ability to resize the cluster from like 1 to 3 is sort of the canonical one that most people seem to want to do, and to do minor version upgrades if there ever are sort of sequencing type issues, backups and restores. So those sort of things. But that's sort of that was the big blocker in CUPS, and we have hopefully overcome that now, and we're proceeding. We have a roadmap where it's sort of optional at the moment, and by 1.13 it will be mandatory to use the manager, and you can still in theory stay on etcd2, but there's no reason to by that time, and you'll be unsupported.
Yeah, I also think didn't etcd2 support in the API server get deprecated?
Yeah, it's going to be removed in 1.13. So
yeah.
We can't force anyone to do it, but certainly we will be. Everyone at that stage will have had a whole release where everyone will be using the etcd manager. Anyone that's following the CUPS release schedule will be using the etcd manager in the previous release, and so there really should be no reason, hopefully by then, to stick with it.
Sorry, what component is etcd manager part of? I'm a new member here.
Yeah, so CUPS has an etcd manager built into it, and we're splitting it out, and I'm working currently in a repo called Copio etcd manager, and I'm actually working right now on getting that to be an associated project, I think it's called, which is like a shares or values type thing. That's actually not the most, I don't know if anyone else has tried that. It is not the most trivial thing. It is not the trivial thing I imagined it to be. So I'll first of all get that hopefully working, and then hopefully improve the process there, and then hopefully we can move this, if people want to, we can maybe move it under Kubernetes SIGs if this SIG is interested in adopting that project. That would be wonderful, but I haven't proposed that yet, so that's on me.
Sounds good. Thank you.
Yeah, cool. I'll check out what it looks like. Just to clarify, you said it's working to upgrade from etcd2 to etcd3 in HA mode, right?
So it is not. It does an upgrade of HA clusters without data loss, but it's not. It is not an HA upgrade. So there is a minute in which there is disruption. There's like the etcd cluster goes down, but this is the only way that I know of to do an upgrade of an HA cluster. None of the sort of the built-in tooling does not yet work.
Yeah, the original instructions were turned down to one. You had to do it to a temporary offline upgrade. That was always the original instructions.
Right. Yes, and so there was so the sort of the image. You can't just like change the image version with the etcd image and expect it to work in an HA mode.
Yeah, so the original instructions, because I helped write them, was tune down to 1, upgrade the 1, wipe out the data for the other ones to make sure that when you bring up the new ones online, they sync with the main new master who's been upgraded. And then as you add new members back, it would percolate the data across the new hosts.
Yeah, so hopefully we'll never have this etcd upgrade scenario again.
I hope not. Like that. I mean, this gets into a different conversation that I don't even want to get into here. But I would hope that we'd never do that again.
Okay, cool. So do you have a date set for COPS 110?
COPS 110, probably pretty soon actually, but no firm date, but more sort of when it's ready. But we were really blocking on the etcd manager, which isn't actually going to be required yet. But so it's basically ready, but we'll probably just do that this week, next week, sort of thing, or
Cool.
like beta week next week, sort of thing.
Cool. Any other like annoying things or like things we should like that we could bring up to the general SIG?
Thinking a lot about add-ons and how that's going to work in COPS. Haven't really figured out anything yet. Other than that, I don't think there's anything majorly annoying. We're going to look at adopting the Machines API, which is going to be awesome, I think, at least for the nodes. And the masters is going to be trickier, but get the Machines API going for the nodes, I think, will be an interesting adoption.
I think the PSA regarding, because this overlaps with cluster API stuff, the work that you were mentioning, Lucas, that we wanted to eventually get the cluster configuration to match the cluster configuration of cluster API for KubeADM. That's kind of a long-term objective that overlaps with some of this stuff.
Yeah. So I'm just gonna write it. Thinking. Okay. So yeah, I shared a doc last week in the KubeADM breakout group, which I'm linking now. There we go. You can find it in the meeting notes. And KubeADM version 1 beta 1 API. So basically, eventually we want the KubeADM, the cluster part of KubeADM to match the cluster API. And I attended a meeting last week, and we came to the conclusion that at least initially, KubeADM will have more knobs and be a superset of the cluster API, which right now has very few options to be set. One thing that isn't clear to me yet is like, how do we wire in component configuration into the cluster API? Because that's going to be a really interesting problem. And that is also the kind of thing we're facing with KubeADM. We don't have many knobs ourselves. We have a few, and those will probably be migrated to component config when that day comes. Other things are like image for the Docker image to pull, or like Kubernetes version to use for the API service, or stuff like that. So it's pretty thin, but still more than what the cluster API has currently. So feature gates is another thing. Like, and then we haven't figured out yet how to map KubeADM AJ masters into the configuration. That is still to be discussed, and I hope we could have some insight from, for example, COPS on that side, like on how to deal with the configuration there, and like, do we support configuration skew between masters, like version skew, what to do with the certificates? Do all masters have unique certificates for all of the things, or do they share some that can be shared? The only thing that can't be shared is like the service account key, and we have to find a way to manage like the different CA keys as well, stuff like that. How do we wire such things into the API without bloating the config? That is to be discussed. And then when we have a small set of knobs we absolutely need, how do we let the user use component configuration that is eventually going to come to specify exactly these are the things I want my API server, like these are the knobs I want to do for the API server.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. Listen, I think like the really tricky case is like, how do you allow a user override of one flag? It's sort of like there's how do you allow a user override, not lose the user and not lose the user overrides when you like a new version of Kubernetes needs a different set of flags, right? How do you effectively merge those changes? And this same problem applies to add-ons as well, which are also add-ons being the things that are cluster managed, but is generally like across the board a problem. And I think Kustomize which was formerly called K-Inflate, is a great solution, but it's not clear exactly how that fits in. And so those are sort of I don't have any answers, but those are like what I'm trying to grapple with as well.
Just a general question because you mentioned it. Now that you've switched gears a little bit, is there any plan at all to focus at all on add-ons? Because we talked about add-ons V2 for like over a year plus. Are you going to have bandwidth cycles to execute on pieces of these?
Yes, I'm definitely working on add-ons right now. I just don't know what that even means at the moment. Thinking about, do we want to use the operator pattern for everything? Do we want to stick with a more narrowly scoped revamp? That sort of, I'm currently today I'm mostly leaning towards operators, but tomorrow it may be more narrowly scoped. I think I'm trying to find a happy medium where we can have the option, make operators as lightweight as what we have today. I think would be a nice place to be, but I don't know if I can get there.
Okay. Yeah, cool. Thanks for letting us know that. Yeah, so the promise of component configuration versus flags is like, it gets way easier to manage this because we can use automatic version upgrades in like conversions that is done seamlessly by the API machinery. So that is partially going to solve it, but still it's going to be a problem. And like for us, for example, Kubernetes has a minimum bar of security. So on some fields, we do enforce stuff. So we enforce the authorization modes to be at least node and RBAC. Because if you don't do that, it's like the cluster is going to break effectively. So that's why we're not letting the user shoot themselves in the foot. They can still go like, and this is like at Kubernetes init time. You can still, if you really, really, really want it, you can go and edit the static pod and there you go. But like such things like, how do you find a line between what we enforce in the component that is owning the thing and the user letting the user override? So there's going to be a lot of overlap when talking about these cluster configuration changes between COPS, the cluster API, and Kubernetes, because we want all these and the add-ons, and the rest of the SIGs that are talking component configuration. So finding some kind of action plan, and because that's a lot of material and a lot of communication and a lot of like discussion overall. So finding a way to execute on that would be crucial to the rest of the ecosystem long term and short term as well. We're about to say something, Justin?
I don't want to. It is a tricky problem. If you allow users to change things, do they change it through like Kubernetes or the machines API, or do they change it through those are like, do they change it through their installation tooling, or do they change it online in their cluster itself? And if they do the latter, how do we track it back and preserve that change? If we should preserve that change. So for example, suppose we introduce a new better auth mode, right? Like ACLs, right? So previously you've enforced, the user is like opted into RBAC with an override flag. Now ACLs are better. Do we like trump the RBAC thing? Do we keep the RBAC thing because the user explicitly specified it? You in Kubernetes don't want to reject anything that is in RBAC and anything else because there's a new mode that you don't yet know about. There are a lot of these sort of evolution cases that are, I think, challenging to reason about and are going to be interesting to resolve. I think a reasonable option is to say that changes go through your installation tooling, because your installation tooling is the only one that knows the changes it is making when you upgrade Kubernetes. But then you sort of lose a lot of the benefits of component config, where you want to be able to change things in your cluster itself, maybe. So I guess the question is like, what is that an acceptable trade-off if we effectively like negate component config by saying you can't make cluster changes, you can't make API server changes through component config anymore. It's only for kubeadm.
So what I would like to see then is like the installation tool wrapping the component configs.
I think, yeah, exactly. It has to, certainly for an initial cluster creation, the installation tool is going to create component configs. On an upgrade, maybe it does. And then user modifications, it's not clear where those fit in the path.
Yeah. We'll see, I guess. So, I mean, kubeadm is gonna ever only execute locally. So even though we had this, so if you wanna like this GitOps or controller or operator pattern, whatever, we have to have something like the cluster API that reconciles. So we could have like config maps or whatever that are the source of truth for component config or the cluster config or machines as CRDs or whatever objects type configuration you have. Then we have this reconciler that goes and translates whatever you have to kubeadm upgrade configs or like locally down the node. So I guess we're going to end up with something like that, but getting all these translations right is going to be hard. And that's why we want to try to keep it as like unified as possible.
And I think you're right to call out that the machines API, the cluster API, machines API, like integration with that is going to be the way to make it sane, right?
Yeah.
That if we can get that all happy, then I think we're in, that's the right place to do it, and we just need to express it in the correct way.
Yeah, I agree there. Cool. Any other comments from the SIG about like this broad topic?
I think we need to do a breakout planning session for almost just some of this stuff for 112, because it's kind of overlap between cluster API working group and kubeadm working group, the sub-project names. So I think planning this and being able to like, have everybody on the same team executing would be super helpful, because it's going to cross over pretty heavily.
Cool. And I have a few highlights of what needs to be done in the 111 timeframe still. I'm going to add notes to the discussion we just had soon. But node registration options, are we happy with the name, or do we want to change it? So Fabrizio and I have been talking about, like, is this the right naming? We're basically hosting these common flags that, when executed in kubeadm init or join, gonna yield a node API object. It's like this bootstrap struct with name, taint, extract to the kubelet. That is a string map because that is flags, and then also CRI socket. So this all is local to the node that is executing on, and it's only used in the first time. It's never used afterwards with upgrading and stuff. That's why I call it node registration options. But Fabrizio said
CRI
that.
Socket?
Yeah.
I think CRI socket use it in reset and then join, isn't it?
Yeah, but then it's like, it's still, so CRI socket is gonna be kind of an exception. So I meant it's used in the sense that it's propagated to kubelet in the registration phase. But yeah, it's still used in reset and join, and then I think we're going to store it in the node object as an annotation or whatever. But generally, these are like for initialization. Fabrizio pointed out that he kind of interprets a machine in the machine's API as some kind of thing, be it a virtual machine or real or whatever, a computer running a kubelet, or a computer that is about to run a kubelet, which is essentially the same as node registration things. So should we call it? But what I mean, and we do have a lot in common. This small four field struct have a lot in common with the machine spec or whatever, but it's still a bit, I don't know. In order to avoid confusion, it might be good to separate these two, although they're kind of similar. Yeah, sorry. So we want to have, when running Kubernetes init and join, we need parameters like what is the node name, if it's something else than the host name. What is the taints to register with the kubelet? Because kubelets can only register themselves with taints once. They can't update their own taints afterwards. And what are the CRI socket to use for the kubelet, and what are some instance-specific extra flags to pass to the kubelet. This all I'm wrapping in a struct. And now we're wondering, what should we call this struct in the master node configuration? Should it be node configuration options, node registration options, node whatever, or something like machine? Because it has some overlap with the machine's API fields. And there it's called machine spec. And Fabrizio said that basically we could interpret machine as a computer that is about to run a kubelet, and it's going to turn into a node API object. Fabrizio, was that a good recap of the discussion?
Yes, it is a good recap. So basically, it turns back to the discussion we were having before. What is the roadmap that we are seeing for merging the current Kubernetes API and the cluster API? If we feel comfortable to anticipate some step now, we can call it some machine spec, because already there is a 50% of field overlapping. If we are not comfortable, let's take a name that does not create confusion, and we will see in the next release of the API.
Tim, what do you think? Or anyone else?
I need to take a look at the difference in the API. I did not look at that delta between the two to see what the overlap is. So perhaps if you give me a link to the other thing to cross-reference, and I can take a look at it by tomorrow, because we have a conversation tomorrow.
Yeah, Fabrizio has, in the PR, he has linked the other spec.
I'll take a look at it.
Okay. Are folks happy with, for example, annotating the node with the CRI socket?
I was not happy with you had a separate comment for annotation. I don't remember. There's been so many PRs now, I'm losing my mind. So that I don't know if this is the one or not, but I do recall you saying you wanted to do an annotation versus an actual field, and I was confused as to why.
So I meant that. So post, we don't need to. So let's say it like that. CRI socket is something that is specific to every node, basically, running in the cluster. So if we have n nodes, there's n there can be n different CRI sockets. And hence it needs to be node specific in some way. And it's only used, these options are only used in the kubeadm init or kubeadm join execution time. We only know about this. So my question is, when we still know the CRI socket for this given node that we're creating, should we upload this information to the cluster somewhere, like the node API object in the cluster that got created? Should we say that, hey, just for your information and for people in the future, this node is using this CRI socket. So when we do upgrades or whatever, we could check the node API object and say, okay, I can talk to the CRI.
Lucas, why not? Why not just config map with some predefined name so we can programmatically get it?
I get what he's saying. That makes a lot of sense. I'd be surprised about why it wouldn't be in the status for the node API object as it exists today. I mean, I understand the reason why.
I think that would be way better, but like, I think it's too late to do for 1.11.
Oh man. It's a creation of debt though. And the question is, like, we'd have to make sure in the next cycle it turned into a field in the node status object. Config mapping it would be a little weird, because then you'd have separate config maps for every single node, where you could potentially have like a weird mixed cluster because you're crazy. Like if you wanted to test all the different CRI implementations, yeah, that's like an edge case, totally an edge case. But the having it relate directly to the node makes a lot of sense.
But why I'm talking about config map, because we have another use cases, for example, when we're enabling FPGA. So we still need to store some information specific for one node. And for us, config map is more natural.
Yeah, but I think this would be a perfect use of node status. I could try to like put together a quick PR or whatever of that and see what SIG node thinks, because I've been doing node status updates before, and it's not that much code, I think, but I realize it might get too late. So are we okay with an annotation as the weird workaround hack we have to do for kubeadm, with the logic goal of getting it into node status, because it's kind of crucial information about the kubelet?
Now that I understand exactly what you're doing, I'm okay with an annotation, provided we link in triplicate, like the plan for this to graduate to a field in 112 in status, in node status.
Yeah. Okay, that is good. So we'll take the node registration options naming tomorrow. We're okay with using the annotation meanwhile, just to like, because we have to get it working. But yeah, then the config migrate thing. So just a quick note on that. It's only needed for people feeding kubeadm a config file that is old and converting it to a new API version. So it's like just this API machinery filter over it. I have my old config. I want it to be converted into the new config. It's never going to touch the cluster. It's like a Unix pipe kind of thing. So with that in mind, is it okay? Because like this is basically it's just extracting a little piece that kubeadm does every time it reads a file, but just exposing that to the user without doing anything else. Yeah, by old I mean like config from. So we're introducing a new API version in version 1 alpha 2 in 1.11, and by old I mean everything before that. Or like it could be any version as well. Like when the new version now has gone old, it can upgrade that as well.
So I apologize. I totally spaced for half of this because I hate Slack. But are you talking about the kubeadm config migrate?
Yeah.
And you want to do exactly what again in detail?
So the use case is I have a config file I wrote for Kubernetes 110.
Yeah.
I now want to write a config file that is using the new API, but I don't want to read 20 pages on what changed between the version 1 alpha 1 version and version 1 alpha 2 version.
Yeah. But why can't you do an upgrade plan or diff?
Yeah. So every Kubernetes interaction is going to do this automatically. So let's say you run Kubernetes init with the old file. That's going to work. If you run Kubernetes upgrade against the old file, it's going to work. But I'm just talking about this kind of Unix pipe thing that I feed an old config to Kubernetes. It's going to write the same representation in the new one. So for people that want to upgrade the YAML files they have checked into Git themselves without creating a new Kubernetes cluster somewhere, like just spinning up a VM to run Kubernetes in it so we can see the output of what's stored in the cluster now based on the old file.
Well, that use case wasn't spelled out in the original PR, but I support that use case. If you have an independent, GitOps type of flow for your actual cluster creation, then having the ability to be able to version that file independently without you having to like go to the cluster to do a diff is a useful operation. I think my original contention was like, do we want to add this and fully support it for ever? Other than that, it seems reasonable. Let's just document it appropriately.
Yeah, so it's totally like a user convenience thing. Okay, so now I have. Did you want to speak to the last thing? We have like 0 minutes left, but if you have, or was it just for your information?
It's kind of for your information. I'd like to see if anybody's working on EDE or testing stuff. I'd love to pair with them, possibly report it and return that into documentation for onboarding, because I'd like more tests being written easier by more people.
Kubernetes specific ETV or just general ETV?
No, general. Any SIG. I'm actually going to jump over to SIG node next. I
think I can poke Liz, but she's already booked right now. Perhaps she can. I don't want to throw her underneath the train, but we can eventually, when she frees up a little more.
That'd be wonderful.
Cool.
It was fun, Lucas. Thank you for your time.
Perfect. That's all for this week, and see you tomorrow or next week. Bye.
Bye.
Thanks, Lucas.